So Game Design 2, Lecture 3, Segment 1, The Odds of Success. As I mentioned, I like to start most of my lectures with a question. So here's a question, which is going to bring on a little bit of doom and gloom, but we'll talk about it, come to a happy place, and all be better for it in the end. So here's the question. What happens when you spend your time, your effort, your creativity, your blood, your sweat, your tears, you pour it into a game or a project that you love and nobody comes? Nobody cares. Nobody downloads it. Nobody plays it. Nobody's writing great reviews of it. Nobody's buying the DLC. What do? Stop and ask yourself for a minute. What would you do? What would you actually do first? And then where would you go from there? A lot of my students say, well, first I'd cry. Yeah, it hurts. It stings. It's a very natural human emotional response when we put our best into something and nobody seems to care about it to feel a little down about it. So yeah, by all means, cry, get it out. But then what do? Sometimes students will say, well, I would try to fix it. I would try to remarket it. I would try to figure out why nobody played it, why nobody downloaded it, and I'd make it better, and I'd make it work. That determination, that's great. How would you go about figuring that out? Well, like I say a lot this month, one of the common ways is to collect data, analyze that data, and form an action plan. That's largely what you're doing in your project this month, is you are iterating on different versions of your project, of your creative product, and you are collecting data, analyzing it, and then making an action plan for the next revision. Then lather, rinse, repeat. So yeah, absolutely. So what are some things that you could change? You could look at mechanics, some of the features that you implemented, what players liked, what they didn't like, where they were having trouble, where they got stuck, where they got lost, where they were confused. Absolutely that introduce, practice, and master. Maybe you weren't giving them enough time to learn a new skill or a new feature or a new mechanic before you really challenged them with it. Remember the flow curve review from Lecture 1. If we get too difficult too quickly, then we're going to frustrate our players. Alternatively, maybe they were bored. Maybe you didn't throw them enough challenge. So these are all good reasons. But before we get into that, why am I asking you this question? Why do you think I'm asking you the question, what would you do if you made something and nobody cared, nobody played it? Well, a lot of you probably know it's because more likely than not, it's going to happen to you. Here are some numbers, just a data pull from the summer of 2008 to the summer of 2016 of games released for the iOS platform. So this is not all iOS apps. These are just apps released through iTunes that self-designated as game. Also, it's not all games on all consoles. We're not talking about Xbox games, PlayStation games, Steam games, Nintendo games. We're talking about just games on the iOS platform. And as you can see, those numbers are ridiculous. And they get so large so quickly, sometimes a little more helpful to look at them as games per day. So over that same time period, this is us breaking down games per day. The spikes that you see are related to different iOS releases. And everybody likes to release their games in time for the new iOS, take advantage of the new features. Like when the Watch released, everybody wanted to release a Watch game, et cetera, et cetera. So those are a little bit of kind of a data outlier. But still, when we look at those games per day, we're talking at peak close to 2,000 games in a single day. And even that median there of 1,000 games per day. If you think about that's crazy. Those numbers are very high. The question that I like to ask to put it in perspective is, if anybody remembers the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System, the great-grandfather, if not the great-great-grandfather of all home gaming. Some would say this is what really launched home console gaming, this platform, this console, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Do you know how many games were released for that entire console? The entire library. You don't have to Google it. I'm going to tell you. But just take a wild guess. how many total games were released for the NES console? Well, the number varies a little bit if you count games released in North America or games released worldwide, but it's roughly around 843. 843 total games for the NES platform. That's less than were released one day in the summer of 2016. So why do I bring these numbers up? Well, because there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of other games, and full disclosure, are some of these games shovelware? Absolutely. Are some of them just an empty Unity level that somebody put up on the App Store so they could call themselves an iOS game developer and only themselves and their mother downloaded it? Yeah, probably. But it's still competition. They are still competing for eyes and attention and downloads and likes and reviews, all the things that your product is going to need if you're going to release a successful, in this case, iOS game. So when we talk about competition, what are we really talking about? Yeah, they're competing for all that stuff I just said, eyes and reviews and downloads. But really, where does it become important to you as a professional game developer? Now, if you're a hobbyist, maybe you don't care about money as much as you do releasing a fantastic, mind-blowing, conscious-altering product. But when you're paid to do this job, when you expect your design capabilities to put food on the table for you and your loved ones, well, then it all comes down to revenue. So here's a look at a graph revenue split comparing the top 870 games to the rest of them. The bottom 1.2 million. Again, we're talking about just the games released on the iOS platform in the same period of time. We noticed that they split the revenue, the total revenue generated, by about 40% for the top 870 and 60% for the remaining 1.2 million games. So maybe you kind of see where this is going, but let's just throw a number at this revenue to put it into context and to talk about it as an example. And let's also round that top 870, let's make that 1,000. Let's say the top 1,000 games suck up, acquire, monopolize 40% of the revenue. That'll make the math a little bit easier. And let's make up a number like 100 million. So let's say that iOS games, all revenue for iOS games in a month is $100 million. This is downloads, subscriptions, DLC, microtransactions, advertising, anything that generates $1 of revenue for that game, for that publisher, that is incorporated into this graph. So just as an example, let's say 100 million in a month. How much does each of those top 1,000 games acquire from that 100 million in revenue? Well, if you first take the 100 million, 40% of that, you got your 40 million, divided by 1,000 games, that comes out to about $40,000 per month for each of those top 1,000 games. Now, who out there wants to make $40,000 a month on a game that you release on iOS? Yeah, I would. That'd be great. More than most people make in a year, every month for a game. Sounds awesome. So let's do the math for the remaining 1.2 million. Now, 60% of that 100 million, that's even more money than the top 1,000 games get, right? They're getting 60 million, whereas the top 1,000 only got 40 million. But as you're probably already thinking, there's a lot more hands snatching at a piece of that pie. So do the math, run it to ground, and you're looking at about $50, $60 per month per game. Anybody want to make $50 a month on an iOS game? Well, yeah, you can raise your hand. I would. How much are you making on your games now? So it's nothing to sneeze at. Exactly. Yeah, I would want to make that as well. That's a new game per month, or some pizza, or a night out at a restaurant. That sounds great. So yeah, take it. But now that I've broken this revenue share down for you, what's the burning question in your head? What is the burning question that all of my aspiring game designers want to ask after I show this revenue split graph? Yeah, it's how do I graduate from the bottom 60% to the top 40%? How do I get out of the noise of the 1.2 million games sharing 60% of the revenue up to just the 870 sharing 40% of the revenue? And I'll tell you, only about 1.5 games per month get to graduate to that elite club of that top 870, top 1,000 40%ers club. But it's good that you're asking that question. It's good that you want to know, well, how do I separate my game from the others? And that is largely what this lecture content is about. How can we give ourselves the best chance at having a game that graduates to being a profitable, decently profitable title? Now, before we get into all of that, I want to do a quick reminder of two types of distributions that you should have already seen in statistics if and when you took statistics. We have the normal distribution and the Pareto distribution. Now, think back to what you know about each of these two distributions. The normal distribution is the much more known and popular one. Anybody remember anything about the normal distribution, how it works? Well, it's independent events explained by means. So the means being the center point. Most of the samples lie closest to the mean, the average, and then to the extremes, fewer and fewer samples are seen. What do we think of when we think of the normal distribution? We think of grades, right? We see that bell curve. When you talk about a professor or instructor grading on a curve, that's where we expect, or one would expect, most of the grades to be somewhere around a B with a few A's and a few C's and very little D's and F's and very little perfect scores. But normal distribution covers lots of things. How much cereal is in an actual cereal box? You know, it's not the perfect amount of ounces or grams or what they print on the label each time. It's close to that. That's definitely the mean, the average. But some have a little bit more, some have a little bit less. Coffee in a Starbucks cup, size of a snowflake. Most snowflakes are relatively close to the same average size. You don't see any massive snowflakes falling from the sky. Also, you don't see any microscopic ones either, or very few. Lifetime of a light bulb. How long is this light bulb going to last? Generally, they last around the same time, but some a little longer, some a little less. You get the idea. That's your normal distribution. To cover a reminder of the Pareto distribution, what comes to mind? What do you think of? Now, unlike the normal, Pareto is non-independent events dominated by extremes. So the Pareto distribution is dominated by extremes. So we see here that the largest number of samples lie in that extreme, and then it drastically tailors off down to just a few samples for the remainder of the set. And just a side note, Pareto distribution is kind of anecdotally known as the 80-20 rule. You know, 80% of the whatever lies in 20% of the sample. One of the things that resonates most with students when I talk about Pareto distribution is the distribution of wealth. Pareto has been applied to wealth distribution around the planet for a long time because, as we know, a very small subset of the population has the vast majority of the wealth of the world, leaving just a little bit of wealth for all the rest of us. Earthquake, the size of earthquakes. There's a few just earth-shattering, high on the Richter scale earthquakes, but there are tremors going on all the time that we don't even see, don't even make the news, people don't even notice. Populations of cities. There are a few just massive, highly populated cities around the world, Beijing, Tokyo, Hong Kong, New York, things like that. And think about all the different cities, towns, villages, townships that have just a little bit of the population. So these are all examples of the Pareto distribution. Now, given what I showed you on the last slide, what do you think? All right, Parth, What's your question? Can you type it into chat? Guys, it's going to be the easiest to get questions answered, rather because I can't tab out of the slide presentation to answer raised hands. If you'll just go ahead and type your questions into chat, that would be the best. So I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to wait for that question, and we're just right around the corner from a break, and I'll get that answered, okay? So given what I showed you on the last slide about the distribution of wealth, given what I showed you on the last slide about the distribution of revenue between the top 870 games and the remaining 1.2 million, if you were to venture a guess at which of these two distributions the revenue split for commercial games followed, which do you think? Do you think that most games get a nice balance of wealth and there's a few games that get a lot and there's a few games that get a little? No, absolutely. Games, like distribution of wealth in the world, follow the Pareto distribution. That small set of 870 games compared to the 1.2 million other games, they monopolize the vast majority of the wealth that is generated, of the revenue that is generated by games. These are your big blockbuster games by your well-known studios and publishers. They're also, stepping outside of just iOS, they're your games like Madden and Call of Duty and Warcraft and Fortnite and all these things that consistently, year after year, are just monopolizing vast amounts of revenue spent on commercial games. So, and there's many reasons for that. We're gonna talk about that after we watch this video on the next slide. But given this, I like to pose this statement to students. Finish this statement for me. Since the odds are against me, since there's a lot of noise competing for attention and revenue, and since there's a massive amount of other games out there that my game might not even be noticed, and since the odds are stacked against me with the distribution of revenue for games creating a successful, profitable game is a lot like winning the lottery. So next we're going to listen to Darius Kazemi tell us about winning the lottery.